Hope everybody's doing splendidly. I apologize that I'm not there, but as I told some of you on Saturday, unfortunately, our baby is having some more issues. We're having to spend a few days in Philadelphia to try to get some tests and procedures and things done up there. So we'll be there for a few days. I will hopefully be back on Friday, um, and hopefully, but we'll be doing some review stuff on Friday. Just so you kind of know what we'll be doing or going through this week. Today we'll talk about BenitoCereno for a little bit, or I'll talk about it since I can't hear any of you. Tomorrow, probably won't do a whole lot with Benito-Sereno. Wednesday will be the only day that you're actually getting a grade for an activity. That'll be a discussion about the end of Benito-Sereno, and you'll do that through the discussion boards on Canvas. So I'll set that assignment up for you, but that'll be the only grade you get this week. I'm not planning on giving you a vocabulary quiz on Friday for a couple of reasons. I would just rather use that time to review. So regardless, your homework tonight and tomorrow night, finish BenitoCereno by Wednesday so that you can participate in that activity, and you can divide the rest of it up however you choose to do so. But if you can have it finished by Wednesday, that would be great. Other than that, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, and probably part of today, depending on how long this lecture takes, you guys will be doing some review activities. I have posted the review packet that we worked on Saturday morning. I've posted that on Canvas under the module for this week, so you can look through that. There's a lot of great resources there. There's some practice questions. There's some multiple choice strategies. There's some character activities, some plot activities that we did not have time to get to at the review session on Saturday, but I might try to have you guys do this week while I'm gone. Aside from that discussion assignment on Wednesday, everything I'm doing this week, I just want it to be beneficial to you as we prepare for the exam. Wednesday I will also have you do some MWDS activities, and I know that you all hate those, but let me just say this. I want it to be something that helps you, not something for me to grade. So if you don't feel like the author's background is going to help you, don't fill that part out. If you don't feel like the quotations part is really going to help you, don't fill that out. But I do want, as you go into studying over the weekend and studying next week, I do want you to have a good list of books that you can look at. And we've done MWDSs now for several of the things we've read. But Wednesday, what I want to do, and we kind of worked on this Saturday, but people were unfocused, I guess, to say the least, is I want you to find some book that we did not read in this class, but that would be applicable to the AP exam. So that might mean something you've read in my Shakespeare class. It could be Things Fall Apart. It could be Night. It could be A Raisin in the Sun, Romeo and Juliet, To Kill a Mockingbird, Great Gatsby, Scarlet Letter, Catcher in the Rye. Pretty much anything you've read in school will probably be good. All of those things at one point or another have showed up on the AP Lit exam. So maybe pick a book that you remember fondly or that you feel confident writing about. And I'd like for you to try to have that on Wednesday. I will try to have copies of most of the stuff that you guys would have read. I'll have copies of like Gatsby and the Scarlet Letter and To Kill a Mockingbird and stuff at the front of the room, so you guys can use those if you want to go back and look through them. But my hope is that you know the books we've read this year pretty well, and that going into the exam next week, you can also refresh your mind on one or two of the books that you had read in a previous year or different class. So that's kind of where we're going this week. Friday, if I'm back by then, we'll do a couple review games to try to get our heads thinking about some different stuff. So that's pretty much the schedule for this week. That's what we'll be doing. Monday and Tuesday next week we will be reviewing, although I know several of you will be at AP exams, so you're not going to miss anything besides review. There won't be any sort of makeup assignments or anything like that. Today I want to talk about BenitoCereno, though. Most of what I'm doing are just from my notes in the book. I haven't really planned this out all that well because I just haven't had as much time as I was hoping I would this weekend. But regardless, I've pulled up your copy of it right here, so hopefully I can find everything that I want to reference and can find it on your pages. So to start with, we talked about how the book starts off as kind of it's very unclear. There's some gray descriptions. It's not clear what the ship is doing that Captain Delano sees. Um, so it's described in a very sort of unsure way, or things um, you can't tell a lot by the appearance of things. That theme or that idea carries over into the story itself, that things just may look one way, but in reality are something else, that they may um, look some way, but it's not really clear what that means. So I think I mentioned this last class, that Melville is just really great because there's so many things that you can read into about him, and almost every sentence seems to have some sort of meaning or deeper understanding, which is really great. So the first thing I want to point out to you is this paragraph here on page 4. He's describing the ship. He says her keel seemed laid, her ribs put together, and she launched from Ezekiel's valley of dry bones. It's not a very good description if your ship looks more skeletal than ship-like. In the present business in which she was engaged, the ship's general model and rig appeared to have undergone no material change from their original warlike Froissart pattern. However, no guns were seen. The tops were large and were rallied about with what had once been an octagonal network, all now in sad disrepair. These tops hung overhead like 3 ruinous aviaries, in one of which was seen a perched on a ratlin, a white noddy, a strange fowl, so called from its lethargic somnambulistic character, being frequently caught by hand at sea. Battered and moldy, the castellated forecastle seemed some ancient turret long ago taken by assault, and then left to decay. So the ship isn't in great shape. There's decaying things. It looks like it was made to do something else, but now it's been made into a slave ship. We see down here too at the end that on the front of it there is a satyr in a mask holding his foot on the prostrate neck of a writhing figure, likewise masked. That's a pretty grim description of things. That's kind of a violent, dominating image. But it makes sense for a slave ship that if this ship is a slave ship, that's kind of what white men were doing, right? They were kind of burdening these African Americans that they were getting. Let's see where the next thing is. So next, on page 5, this paragraph here, down near the bottom of it, so maybe actually page 6. The ship seems unreal. These strange costumes, gestures, and faces, but shadowy tableau just emerged from the deep, which directly must receive back what it gave. The ship seems unreal. That seems to fit very well with sort of the beginning descriptions of it. Hopefully by now you realize something is not right with this ship, right? Its purpose wasn't clear from the beginning. Its appearance looks kind of dead almost, I guess. It has a very frightening image on the front of it. And now they say that it seems unreal. So all of that is kind of odd. We know that it is a slave ship. You can see here at the top of this paragraph, climbing the side, the visitor was at once surrounded by a clamorous throng of whites and blacks, but the latter outnumbering the former more than could have been expected, Negro transportation ship as the stranger in port was. So it's a slave ship, but there are far more African Americans than there are white people. So the next thing I want to point out to you is this here. Though occasionally the 4 oakum pickers would briefly address some person or persons in the crowd below, yet the 6 hatchet polishers neither spoke to others nor breathed a whisper among themselves, but sat intent upon their task except at intervals when the peculiar love in negroes of uniting industry with pastime, two and two they sideways clashed their hatchets together like cymbals with a barbarous din. All six, unlike their generality, had the raw aspect of unsophisticated Africans. So there's a couple of things here. I want you to think about the book in the context of, if things are not always as they seem, things haven't been clear up to this point. Captain Delano sees that these peculiar Negroes have a uniting industry with pastime where they come and they clash their hatchets together like cymbals with barbarous din. Well, what does that look like to him? It looks unsophisticated, right? What is that really? What are they really doing? Is it really unsophisticated? If everything about this ship is kind of unclear or not exactly the way that it seems, then it stands to reason that he's misunderstanding something. Captain Delano is not really fully aware of what's going on. We've already talked about how he is, what's the word they use? Undistrusting, or whatever weird word, undistrustful good nature. So he kind of just takes things as they are, right? He sees these African American slaves banging things around, and he just assumes they're unsophisticated barbarians, right? That's just what they do. That's just how they act. And he kind of takes those sorts of things at face value. We'll see that that's a big mistake, that undistrustful nature, that he just kind of accepts things as they are, doesn't really work in this story because things aren't as they seem. Good. And okay, the next part here is just at the top of page 7, this paragraph here. But as if not unwilling to let nature make known her own case among his suffering charge, or else in despair of restraining it for the time, the Spanish captain, a gentlemanly, reserved-looking, and rather young man to the stranger's eye, dressed with singular richness, but bearing plain traces of recent sleepless cares and disquietude, stood passively by, leaning against the mainmast, at one moment casting a dreary, spiritless look upon his excited people, at the next an unhappy glance towards his visitor. By his side stood a black of small stature, in whose rude face, as occasionally like a shepherd's dog, he mutely turned it up into the Spaniard's, sorrow and affection were equally blended. Struggling through the throng, the American advanced to the Spaniard, assuring him of his sympathies and offering to render whatever assistance might be in his power, to which the Spaniard returned, for the present, but grave and ceremonious acknowledgments, his national formality dusked by saturnine mood of ill health. So we're introduced to the other two important characters here. One's name is Babbo, and then the other one here is Captain Cereno. But I want you to look also at their characterization here. We have the Spanish captain, who is gentlemanly and reserved looking. He's dressed with a singular richness, but he is bearing plain traces of recent sleepless cares and disquietude. So he's had a rough time, right? The slave next to him, on the other hand, who has a rude face, and he's like a dog, in that he just sort of stares up at the white man and is, has sorrow and affection for him. So one thing I'd ask you to be thinking about was whether or not this book was racist. And this is one of those passages that maybe you could kind of argue, if he sees him like a dog, then that's not exactly encouraging. So here's another passage kind of related to the same sort of racist idea I was just mentioning. While left alone with him, he was not so long in observing some things tending to heighten his first impressions, but surprise was lost in pity, both for the Spaniards and black, alike evidently reduced from scarcity of water and provisions, while long-continued suffering seemed to have brought out the less good-natured quality of the Negroes, besides, at the same time, impairing the Spaniards' authority over them. But under the circumstances, precisely this condition of things was to have been anticipated. In armies, navies, cities, or families, in nature herself, nothing more relaxes good order than misery. Still, Captain Delano was not without the idea that had BenitoCereno been a man of greater energy, misrule would hardly have come to the present pass. But the debility, constitutional or induced by the hardships, bodily and mental, of the Spanish captain was too obvious to be overlooked. A prey to settled dejection, as if long mocked with hope he would not now indulge it, even when it had ceased to be a mock, the prospect of that day or evening at furthest, lying at anchor, with plenty of water for his people, and a brother captain to counsel and befriend, seemed in no perceptible degree to encourage him. So, again, if you want to talk about this being a racist work, the fact that the suffering brings out the less good-natured quality of the Negroes is what he writes. Why hasn't it brought out the less good-natured qualities of the Spaniards? Wouldn't it do the same thing to both sets of people? But the other thing that's really interesting about this passage we just read is that Captain Delano was not without the idea that had BenitoCereno been a man of greater energy, misrule would hardly have come to the present pass. In other words, this ship's a mess, and we get hints of that with how it's kind of looking torn down and messed up and everything. But he gets on board. He sees the barbarous African Americans and all the things that they're doing that seem just kind of unruly to him. We have Captain Delano, who for whatever reason can't seem to control all of this and seems just kind of sleepless and dejected. But Captain Delano just has this feeling that if BenitoCereno had just been kind of a better leader, if he had maybe had a little more energy in leading his troops, maybe all this stuff wouldn't have happened and things would have been okay. Captain Delano has this idea or perception that if he can just somehow kind of help BenitoCereno get some of those leadership qualities, that he will be okay. And that's, again, probably a misunderstanding of the situation. Again, going back to Captain Delano, he's a little bit too trustworthy. He doesn't, I don't want to say he doesn't think, but he doesn't take the time to consider things maybe quite as thoroughly as he should have. Let's look at this part. So I want to look a little bit more at this dude Babbo. Okay. His voice was like that of one with lungs half gone, hoarsely suppressed, a husky whisper. No wonder that, as in the state he taught her about, his private servant apprehensively followed him. So we have BenitoCereno is also suffering from a husky voice. He's got some pulmonary complaint. His lungs are quite messed up. He was rather tall, but seemed to have been robust and was now with nervous suffering. BenitoCereno is not the leader that Captain Delano thinks he should be, and it seems to be mostly because of physical stuff, which makes sense since they've been on a boat without a lot of supplies and all that lately. However, his private servant apprehensively followed him. Babbo's being a good guy, right? He is following Captain Delano around apprehensively, worried about his master's health. Sometimes the Negro gave his master his arm or took his handkerchief out of his pocket for him, performing these and similar offices with that affectionate zeal which transmutes into something filial or fraternal acts in themselves but menial, and which was gained for the Negro the repute of making the most pleasing body servant in the world, one, too, whom a master need be on no stiffly superior terms with, but may treat with familiar trust, less a servant than a devoted companion. So this one guy, Babbo, is different than all the other slaves in that he's serving the captain, but he also seems to be maybe more sophisticated than the barbarous slaves that Captain Delano observes on the boat. But he still views them only as a devoted companion, not any kind of leader or anything like that. Captain Delano says that he witnesses the steady good conduct of Babbo. So Babbo seems to be kind of a good-natured guy. Let's see what our next quote So this paragraph, viewing him in this light, it seemed but a natural token of the perverse habit induced by a long course of such hard self-restraint that, notwithstanding the present condition of his ship, the Spaniard should still persist in a demeanor which, however harmless or it may be appropriate in a well-appointed vessel such as the San Dominick might have been at the outset of the voyage, was anything but judicious now. But the Spaniard perhaps thought that it was with captains as with gods. Reserve, under all events, must still be their cue. But more probably this appearance of slumbering dominion might have been but an attempted disguise to conscious imbecility, not deep policy but shallow device. But be all this as it might, whether Don Benito's matter was disguised or not, the more Captain Delano noted its pervading reserve, the less he felt uneasiness at any particular manifestation of that reserve toward himself. Neither were his thoughts taken up by the captain alone. Wonted in the quiet orderliness of the sealer's comfortable family of a crew, the noisy confusion of the San Dominick's suffering host repeatedly challenged his eye. Some prominent breaches not only of discipline but of decency were observed. Those Captain Delano could not ascribe in the main to the absence of those subordinate deck officers to whom, along with higher duties, is entrusted what may be styled the police department of a populous ship. So, we have a few other interesting things happening here. Again, BenitoCereno is just sort of, Captain Delano is just kind of judging BenitoCereno's leadership, right? He doesn't really get why he's acting this way. He thinks that maybe it's just some sort of noble kind of, I'm trying to think of a good word for it, but he's trying to act gentlemanly and captainly. That's what that's what Captain Delano thinks BenitoCereno is doing. But it's interesting here that we have more words about things kind of maybe not being really clear. But the Spaniard perhaps thought's not sure, but more probably, again, still not really sure, but an attempted disguise to kind of something disguised. But be all this as it might, whether Don Benito's manner was designed or not, we have several things there that kind of aren't clear. We have noisy confusion a little bit later on. This is similar to the beginning when some of the things they're trying to figure out are not entirely clear. So let's see. Let's go a little bit farther down to that's not good. Okay, here we go. Don Benito faltered then, like some somnambulist, which is like somebody who's walking in their sleep, suddenly interfered with, vacantly stared at his visitor, and ended by looking down on the deck. He maintained this posture so long that Captain Delano, almost equally disconcerted and involuntarily almost as rude, turned suddenly from him, walking forward to accost one of the Spanish seamen for the desired information. But he had hardly gone 5 paces when, with a sort of eagerness, Don Benito invited him back, regretting his momentary absence of mind and professing readiness to gratify him. So Captain Delano is again criticizing how Don Benito is doing things. So I want you to think about this for a second and how we do this too. You know, we talked a little bit the other day about whether or not you are kind of one of those people who are, undistrusting or whatever it was, but whether or not we just sort of naturally trust people or don't. And this is something that's really, I don't want to say realistic, but it is kind of realistic, right? You're in an unknown situation, you're meeting somebody for the first time, you're seeing how they're interacting, and you're kind of automatically making judgments about that person's character. You're making judgments about what they're doing. And as I've already hinted at, and you might see, those things aren't always accurate. And when I was in college working on my psychology degree, I had to take not a school psychology, a social psychology class. Social psychology more or less says that you are made up of everything that happens around you. So if you're in a bad mood today, you're in a bad mood because of something that happened before class. If you're in a good mood today, you are in a good mood because of something that happened before class that made you happy. While I don't necessarily agree with that, one thing that they brought up in the class was that it's difficult to judge people because we don't ever know exactly what led them to that point. If one of you comes into the class in a bad mood, I could judge you and say, well, that kid's just always got a bad attitude and doesn't want to do anything. Or I could take a moment and think, maybe they're having a bad day. So I want you to think about that for a minute and just think about how you do that when you first meet people. I'm sure you do it with teachers when you walk into their classrooms. Most of you have been very open with the fact that I don't think any of you liked me on the first day of class, which is fine. But we do kind of make those immediate conclusions about people, and we all do that. And that's what he's doing here. And I think that one thing Herman Melville wants us to do is just think about sometimes how we're perceiving people and how we're perceiving situations. And that's why so much here seems ambiguous, seems unclear, and then why so much of it is sort of in that gray area. Okay, so I want to look a little bit at Babbo. We've talked a little bit about BenitoCereno here. So this is BenitoCereno telling Captain Delano about Babbo. Yes, their owner was quite right in assuring me that no fetters would be needed with his blacks, so that while, as is wont in this transportation, those negroes have always remained upon deck, not thrust below, as in the Guinea Menthe have also from the beginning been freely permitted to range within given bounds at their pleasure. Once more the faintness returned, his mind roved, but recovering, he resumed. So remember, one of the things that Captain Delano is kind of unsure about here is that all of the African Americans kind of seem to have more freedom than they should have on a slave ship. But it is Babbo here to whom, under God, I owe not only my own preservation, but likewise to him chiefly the merit is due of pacifying his more ignorant brethren, when at intervals tempted to murmurings. Ah, master, sighed the black, bowing his face, don't speak of me. Babbo is nothing. What Babbo has done was but duty. Faithful fellow, cried Captain Delano. Don Benito, I envy you such a friend. Slave I cannot call him. As master and man stood before him, the black upholding the white, Captain Delano could not but bethink him of the beauty of that relationship which could present such a spectacle of fidelity on the one hand and confidence in the other. Okay. So we have quite literally Babbo supporting BenitoCereno, and Captain Delano just thinks this is the greatest thing, right? I can't even call him a slave. He's more like your friend. He's so faithful to you, and so everything about Babbo so far seems to be he's this good, faithful servant. We go from very racist descriptions of him, like him being a dog, to now he's not on an equal field, but now he's kind of more considered a friend here. Let's see here. But when facing about, he saw the whole file, like so many organ grinders, still stupidly intent on their work, unmindful of everything beside. He could not but put a smile on his face at his late fidgeting panic. Presently, while standing with Don Benito, looking forward upon the decks below, he was struck by one of those instances of insubordination previously alluded to. 3 black boys with 2 Spanish boys were sitting together on the hatches, scraping a rude wooden platter in which some scanty mess had recently been cooked. Suddenly, one of the black boys, enraged at a word by one of his white companions, seized a knife, and though called to forbear by one of these oakum pickers, struck the lad over the head, inflicting a gash from which blood flowed. In amazement, Captain Delano inquired what this meant, to which the pale Benito dully muttered that it was merely the sport of the lad. Pretty serious sport, truly, rejoined Captain Delano. Had such a thing happened on board the Bachelor's Delight, instant punishment would have followed. So we go back to Captain Delano criticizing BenitoCereno. But I want you to think for a moment, why does BenitoCereno let this go? We have African Americans who, remember, at this time are slaves. They are on a slave ship, so them hitting a white person would have been like, one of the worst things that they could do. But that's not exactly what he does. He doesn't do anything. A little later on this page, Don Benito says, you would find it advantageous to keep all your blacks employed, especially the younger ones, no matter what useless task and no matter what happens to the ship. Why, even with my little band, I find such a course indispensable. I once kept my crew on quarterdeck thrumming mats for my cabin, when for 3 days I had given up my shipmates, men, and all for a speedy loss, owing to the violence of a gale in which we could do nothing but helplessly drift before, blah, blah, blah. So he's saying you should keep everybody occupied, right? This is how you should run your ship. This is what you should do. Again, Captain Delano is operating under the assumption that BenitoCereno is just not a very good captain, and that's why these things are happening. But I want you to be thinking about it. Why is BenitoCereno letting these things happen? Why is he letting this kind of outrageous thing happening with the fight between people? Let me see where our next point is. Okay. So we have this whole thing going on with Atufal and this weird sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, culture or whatever of the ship that we've been seeing. What, pray, was Atufal's offense, Don Benito asked Captain Delano. It was not something very serious. Take a fool's advice, and, in view of his general docility, as well as in some natural respect for his spirit, remit his penalty. No, master will never do that, here murmured the servant to himself. Pratt Atufal must first ask master's pardon. The slave there carries the padlock, but master here carries the key. His attention thus directed, Captain Delano now noticed for the first time that suspended by a slender silken cord from Don Benito's neck hung a key. At once, from the servant's muttered syllables divining the key's purpose, he smiled and said, So, Don Benito, padlock and key, significant symbols, truly. This is probably one of the things that Captain Delano gets right. Padlock and the key here are kind of significant symbols. But what I want you to notice about this passage is that it's Babbo that answers the question about Atufal's penalty and how the ship's run, not BenitoCereno here. So why do they... I don't know what that means. Why do they do this? Why are they letting Babbo talk and go through with all this? Let me look at one or two more passages and then I will let you guys get on. Observing the ship now helplessly fallen into a current with enchanted sails, drifting with an increased rapidity seaward, and noting that from a lately intercepted projection of the land the sealer was hidden, the stout mariner began to quake at thoughts which he barely durst confess to himself. Above all, he began to feel a ghostly dread of Don Benito. He's finally coming around to the fact that there's something weird going on here. And yet when he roused himself, dilated his chest, felt himself strong on his legs, and coolly considered it, what did all these phantoms amount to? There's all this ghostly language, right? Had the Spaniard any sinister scheme, it must have reference not so much to him, Captain Delano, as to his ship, the Bachelor's Delight. Hint, the present drifting away was one ship from another, instead of favoring any possible scheme, was, for the time at least, opposed to it. Clearly, any suspicion, combining such contradictions, must need be delusive. Besides, was it not absurd to think of a vessel in distress, a vessel by sickness almost dismanned by her crew, a vessel whose inmates were parched for water? Was it not 1,000 times absurd that such a craft should, at present, be of a piratical character, or her commander, either for himself or for those under him, cherish any desire but the speedy relief and refreshment? So he thinks for a minute, something's not right here. Maybe they're out to get me. But then he thinks, no, that can't possibly be it. Remember, he has got this sort of trusting nature about him. But at least he kind of realizes that something's not quite right. We get the words ghostly and phantom there, which are both, relevant. I don't know if you've figured out what's going on yet or not, but it is not a ghost ship, if that is what your guess or your thought was. But there is sort of that feeling of everybody on board is kind of not what they should be. We have a couple more scenes with weird things that the captain doesn't discipline or disciplines oddly. We get some more descriptions where we talk about the grayness of everything. There's so much more stuff I want to talk about, but I'm looking for one particular passage here. I should probably mention this, though, and not skip over it, that page 34, I'm sorry, page 41. So this will actually just be the part that you'll probably read tonight. But Captain Delano took to Negroes not philanthropically, but genially, just as other men to Newfoundland dogs. So Captain Delano, once again, has this sort of perception or understanding that the African Americans are kind of servants, maybe friends if they're like Babbo, but more or less they're kind of like dogs. Again, that's sort of a very racist view, a very racist thought. So I want you to be thinking as you continue to read about Captain Delano's perception of the situation, his perception of BenitoCereno, his perception of Babbo, his perception of the slaves, and then what's really going on. Again, Captain Delano's character trait is that he's kind of trusting and maybe by that doesn't really question a whole lot, and maybe he should. Why is BenitoCereno doing these things? Why is he letting these fights break out and all this stuff go on? Why does Babbo answer for him, it seems, more than other people? Why do we have all this sort of ambiguous language and these phantom mentions and the grayness of things where nothing really seems as clear as it should be? Why is all that happening? So between now and Wednesday, I'd like for you to read. Wednesday, you will receive a grade for, like I said, that discussion-based activity on Canvas. So hopefully you can come with some intelligent thoughts. Email me if you have any questions. I will do my best to respond, and I will hopefully see you guys Friday.